Sherri Rasmussen was a 29-year-old, bubbly, happy and dedicated young woman. Newly married to the man of her dreams, she was content and excited to see what the future had to hold. But sadly, she would never find out. On the 24th of February 1986, Sherri would be brutally murdered in her own home by a woman she knew she couldn't trust. Someone from the past that had no business being in her life or in her home that day. But her killer had many people fooled, and Sherri's murder would remain unsolved for 23 years. Hello my lovelies and welcome back to my channel. I know I've been gone for a really long time. I want to tell you why, I can't tell you why, but let's just say some of the videos that I have filmed became a reality for me, and also I had some health issues that I can talk about, but I'm not going to talk about today because, you know, I don't need to talk about it today. But there's something I can't talk about, and that's why I've been away for such a long time. But I am back now. I'm feeling 1,000,000% better. We're still going through the thing that we're going through, and one of the things that I am allowed to say is that the thing that we're going through will end up in court, so I will have to take some more time off this year, but this time I promise I'll let you all know, because people actually like my videos, which is surprising. I've had some DMs, but it is what it is. We move. So for those of you that don't know, my name is Sally and today is Sunday, so that means it's Slaughter Sunday. And what we do here is I research a ton out of true crime cases, mysteries, missing people, urban legends, scary stories, whatever takes my fancy really, and then I will post the case and we will hopefully open a discussion, whatever we want to do really. So whether you're interested in true crime, or maybe you're slightly obsessed, or maybe you just like my British accent, who knows, please hit that subscribe button and hit the little bell to be notified when I post new videos. I would say on Sundays like I used to say, but at this point who knows. Also just a reminder, as I remind you every video, if you're just here to troll, be mean, say horrible things, don't bother. We're not interested. We don't want you here. I won't tolerate it, and it absolutely costs nothing to be kind. You have been warned. So that's all the boring stuff out the way. As you've probably heard by my intro and you've seen in my thumbnail, today we're going to do a deep dive into the case of Stephanie Lazarus, or the murder of Sherri Rasmussen. And this case absolutely blows my mind. It has at this point become an obsession, and I heard about this case years ago. It's been recommended on my channel several times, and I finally got to the point where I'm going to film it and upload it for you guys. But it's wild. It's not as twisty and turny as some of the cases that you could probably think of, but if you don't know the case, then you're going to be surprised by who did it. Let's just leave it at that. So let's begin. And to find out what happened to Sherri and, you know, how this all happened, we need to go back to the beginning. But first, I'm going to talk you through the day of the crime. So the date is the 24th of February 1986, and this takes place in Los Angeles, California, which we all know is in America. A newly married couple who had actually only been married 3 months at this point, John Rutten and Sherri Rasmussen, woke up in their condominium, which was in a gated community, in a Van Nuys area. I don't really know where that is, but I'll pop it up on a map. John began to get ready to leave the home, as he normally left at about 7:20 a.m. every day, and Sherri actually stayed in bed, as she had decided to stay home this day, something she didn't normally do, but according to John, she had previously hurt her back doing some aerobics, so she decided to take the day off work this day. So John kissed Sherri goodbye, left the condo at the normal time, dropped off some dry cleaning on the way to his work, and he arrived at his work at about 8 a.m. During the day, John said that he made several attempts to contact his wife on the house phone. I don't know if people remember those house phones. We always knew we had a call coming into the house phone because the speaker on our giant computer would start fizzing and buzzing and popping So we'd always know we got a phone call coming through. He called at about 10 a.m. and then about an hour later, but when his calls went unanswered, he got a little bit worried, but he just thought maybe she'd either gone into work or she'd stayed in bed. But just to cover his bases, he decided to call his wife's secretary at her job, and she worked at a hospital. But the secretary, told him that Sherri hadn't come in the office that day. However, it was made clear that this wasn't unusual, as on Fridays, Sherri didn't come into the office as she was in classes teaching all that day because she taught nursing by this point. And we'll talk about more about that later. Also, Connie that day, which is Sherri's sister, called the office too, but she was told the same thing as John. John carried on his day as normal, his work day, and he left work at about 5 p.m. He picked up his dry cleaning on the way home, and he also popped into the bank. And then, as I say, he headed home. He arrived home at about 5:55 p.m. But as soon as he pulled up, he noticed that the garage door was open and his wife's new BMW was gone from the garage. He also noticed that there was a smashed glass in the driveway that seemed to have come from the bedroom window, which was located above the garage. Again, I'll put a photo in so you can see. The fact that the BMW was gone was not a concern to begin with, because he just assumed that his wife had gone out. But once he noticed the smashed glass and he looked up and saw the window was smashed, he was a little bit concerned. As a side note, I do need to say now, because I don't really know where to put this in, that later it would be confirmed by neighbours who lived directly across from the condo where the garage was, had gone for a walk that day. They said that about 8:30 a.m. when they left, the garage was shut, and when they returned at 10:45 it was open and the car was gone. So John entered the house through the door that went from the garage directly into the living room and found his new wife shot and beaten and dead on the living room floor. Sherri was laying on her back and she was still wearing the t-shirt, dressing gown and slippers that she had been wearing when he'd left that morning. The scene was a complete war zone. It was horrendous. There was blood all over the entire house. Furniture was overturned, papers were thrown about. Their sound system, or what we call now probably a stereo, had been moved and placed at the bottom of a set of steps. Seeing this, John freaked out, as you can imagine that anybody would, and he immediately called 911, and the LAPD arrived on the scene within minutes. The lead detective was a man called Lyle Mayer, and he began to search the crime scene and tried to piece things together straight away. Mayer thought that this was probably a robbery that had gone wrong, and the reason he thought this was because there had been some home robberies recently in the area, one of which had actually only been a 5-minute walk away, where 2 Latino men had stolen a sound system. And it all sounds very familiar and similar to what was happening here. At the other burglary, nobody had ended up dead, but it was all very, very similar. So the lead detective, or Mayer, as we're going to call him, kind of jumped to conclusions, I think, and just assumed that this is what happened. I also do need to point out, as another little side note, that these 2 Latino men were never charged, were never sentenced for this crime, but they were caught for the other one. So his theory, Mayer's theory, was that the burglars, or the 2 Latino men, had entered through an unlocked door, not expecting Sherri to be at home, because, as we said earlier, she'd taken the day off work unexpectedly. Mayer determined that she had probably interrupted them and they had panicked and killed her. For whatever reason, maybe he thought that maybe that she recognised them, maybe she knew them from somewhere, or the fact that they weren't really wearing masks or disguises, so she could describe them well to the police, and they just panicked and they murdered her. He also determined that they had probably left the sound system behind in their rush to actually escape, because the scene had escalated so quickly. The police also did find out, once they searched the scene, that there was actually only 2 things that were actually taken from the scene. One was Sherri's new BMW car, which was actually found 10 days after the murder, about 3 miles away. The keys were in the ignition and it had been completely cleaned from top to bottom. And another thing that went missing, which is extremely weird, is John and Sherri's marriage certificate. You'll see why. This will make sense later. Right now, it just seems really, really strange. So I'm going to talk about Sherri's injuries right now. So if you don't want to hear this, that's absolutely fine. You can skip forward. So Sherri had been shot a total of 3 times. once in the heart, once in the lungs, and once in the spine with a .22 caliber gun. 2 bullets were actually inside of her body and 1 had exited through her back. There was also a blanket found close to her body with bullet holes in it and gunpowder all over it, making the police believe that this was probably used as some kind of muffler to keep the shots quiet. She had also been hit over the head with what looked like a vase, which they had actually found broken next to her body, and she had an injury on her head that matched this vase. She had lacerations and markings on her face and her neck. Her eyes were swollen and bruised, and she had a bite mark on the inner left side of her arm. Further to that, they had found she had markings around her wrists, indicating she had been tied up, and the police found a rope near the front door. It was also very, very clear that she had fought really, really hard for her life. The scene was absolutely covered in blood. It was by the front door, it was up the walls, it was absolutely everywhere. And the blood that they found by the front door, that the investigators found, it was actually a large blood stain, and it had 2 of Sherri's fingernails in it. So it was clear she had tried to escape, but she had been pulled back and attacked further, where she ultimately died. Once they arrived, though, they could see that rigor mortis had already begun to set in. Her body was completely cold and stiff, which means they could estimate her time of death, and they estimated it to be earlier in the morning. So between the time that these neighbours said that the garage had been open, so before 10:45 in the morning. Strangely, the forensics team for Sherri didn't actually arrive till 2 a.m. the following morning. They searched for DNA and trace evidence but didn't find a single thing. They did determine Sherri hadn't been sexually assaulted, but they did take samples from the bite on her arm, which was sent to the lab for testing. But back in the 80s, DNA testing was definitely in its infancy, and it wasn't any help with this case at this particular time. We didn't have the developments in forensic science that we have now. So that's what happened on the day. But Sherri was born on the 7th of February 1957 to parents Loretta and Nels Rasmussen in Walla Walla, Washington. Walla Walla. I love that. That's so cool. She had 2 sisters, Connie, who was older, and Teresa, who was younger. The girls were actually all raised in Tucson, Arizona, where they moved when they were young. They were a very close family, the type that would tell each other everything, and they spent a lot of time together. Her father, Nels, was a dentist who ran a very successful dental practice, and Loretta, her mother, worked as the manager at the practice, and they both worked full-time. Sherri was a kind, chilled-out, happy child, which were attributes she took into her adulthood. She was known to be driven and hardworking. She was also very, very intelligent. After high school, she was accepted into the Lazara College in California. She was only 16 years old when she started, as she skipped a few grades due to her hard work and intelligence. At college, she studied nursing, just like her older sister Connie was currently doing, and her great aunt had actually already done. At the end of freshman year, she applied for the Lola Minya School, which was a prestigious nursing school. It was actually quite hard to get into at the time, apparently, but her sister Connie was already attending the school. She got excited. Well, she did get excited. She also got accepted and started that fall. In 1977, in June of 1977, Sherri and Connie both graduated at the same time, which again shows how intelligent Sherri was. She graduated early along with her sister, so she was very clever. A year later, she decided to go and get her master's degree in nursing at UCLA, whilst also working at a hospital there as a staff nurse. And at just 23 years old, by 1980, she was awarded her master's degree and was thrilled. I mean, that's quite an achievement. 23 and she already had a master's degree. I think that's pretty impressive. I'm 33 and I'm only just starting my degree in criminology. The second part is confusing, but I did something else at Lincoln Uni and now I'm doing it. It doesn't matter anyway. I'm still not graduated, so Very impressive. Later that same year, her father brought her a condo in the Van Nuys area of California, where she lived at that time with a roommate and her cat, and this would later be the home that she shared with John and, unfortunately, the house that she was murdered in. Whilst her father was well off and happy to help his daughter, Sherri wasn't the type of person to take handouts, so she made payments of rent to her father every single month. She was not having this as a gift, she wanted to pay her way, and she made payments on time every month. She was hired by the Glendale Adventist Hospital as the Director of Critical Nursing when she was only 27 years old. So this is where she still worked in nursing, which is a job that she absolutely adored, but this is when she also started teaching classes on a Friday, which is what I spoke about earlier. So she was a high up person in the hospital. She'd worked extremely hard and achieved a lot of her goals before she was 30, so she's quite an impressive woman. But there was only one thing missing out of her life, which, as you can all guess, is love. But she hadn't been looking for love. She'd always been so focused on her career. She hadn't really even dated before this point. But in May of the same year, so when she was 27 years old, she met John Rutten. And despite the fact that she wasn't looking for love, she couldn't help but fall for John with his dazzling smile and his thick mop of hair that just captured her heart. They actually met when her friend Anita and her new fiancé were holding a party that her fiancé also invited some of his friends to, and one of his friends was obviously John. John Rutten, was born on the 5th of September 1958 in Eugene, Oregon. His parents were called Margaret and Richard, and he had 3 siblings, a brother called John and 2 sisters called Gail and Jeanette. He actually grew up in San Diego, where the family moved when he was a child. He was tall, dark and handsome. He left school in 1977 and attended UCLA. That's where he graduated in 1981 with a mechanical engineering degree, getting a job as a computer engineer at Data Products straight from leaving school. He was healthy, he was athletic, he was tall, and although there's not a lot out there about his life in general, some of the stuff we're going to talk about we need to save for later. But yeah, he was a good guy, he was a nice guy. He made some mistakes as he gets into his young adulthood, but we all do. But all in all, he was a good guy, and he was perfect for Sherri. So back to this party, and at this party, John spotted Sherri from across the room, all 6'1" of her. She was tall and beautiful, and John was immediately smitten with her. He even asked his friend for her phone number and told this friend that he was going to marry that girl one day. They spent the evening chatting a little bit, getting to know each other, and after a few days after this party, John actually called her and asked her out on a date. Although she was a bit taken aback and a bit nervous because she, like I say, she'd never been on many dates before, she was very happy that he called, and she actually invited him over to her place for some food that she made. And she made him one of my favourite dishes, which is beef stroganoff. Love it. They immediately hit it off and fell heavily and deeply in love very, very quickly. Sherri's parents did not necessarily approve of John to begin with. They didn't like him very much, but they wanted their daughter to be happy, so they let her do her thing. There's not really much as to why they didn't like him. It's probably because they were a close family and nobody was good enough for their daughter. A bit like my dad with me. They got engaged very quickly in May of 1985, and because they were engaged, they decided that it was time for them to move in together. Her roommate moved out, and she was absolutely fine with it. There was no issues, just an FYI. And John moved in. After he moved in, Sherri's father transferred the house into their names, but they continued to make mortgage payments to him, as Sherri had always done. On the 23rd of November 1985, Sherri and John tied the knot in a beautiful ceremony in Pasadena, just surrounded by their family. It was a beautiful day. Sherri looked absolutely stunning. She was just a beautiful lady with her blonde hair and her blue eyes and her gorgeous smile. And she was genuinely and truly happy. And then in December, they decided to go on their honeymoon, and they went to Sandals Beach Resort in Jamaica. Once they returned back to America, and before they actually even came back to their own condo, they ended up going to Christmas at Sherri's parents' home, where they had a lovely Christmas together. John seemed to fit straight into the family. Although the family still weren't that keen on him, they tried, they made an effort, John made an effort, And it was a lovely, lovely Christmas. And then they returned back to the condo as a married couple. And this is also around the time that John actually left his job at Data Point and got a new job at Micropolis. And this is something to do with computer disks. I couldn't really understand it, but it was a techie thing and it was perfect for him. It's what he got his degree for. So back to the police investigation. As I stated earlier, Lyle Mayer was the lead detective in this case and was about as useful as a chocolate fireguard. He was certain that this was just a case of wrong place, wrong time, and just a botched house robbery, so he didn't really look into anything else. He wasn't interested in anybody's theories. He didn't want to listen to the family and the friends, who were, by the way, convinced that this was something more personal. More on that later. The crime scene seemed to be staged, and it didn't make sense to many of the family and friends that the robbers had gone to the house to rob but didn't actually take anything other than a car which they abandoned and a marriage certificate. It's all very strange. Sherri had her jewellery in the house, it was all laying around, there was cash here and there. None of that was taken, although it had been moved. It was just very strange. As the police do, they did look at John, but his alibi was obviously confirmed. He had an airtight alibi and he was seen at work all day. And at the time of the estimated time of her death, he was obviously at work. So, that's that. The day after the murder, Sherri's parents travelled to Los Angeles. Nels, her father, had a meeting with the lead detective and told him that they need to look into John's ex. Now, I haven't mentioned John's ex yet, but she's going to play heavily. He told them that he didn't remember her name, but when he spoke to his daughter on many occasions, Sherri told him about some odd and terrifying moments that she had had with John's ex. Unfortunately, the police told him that he was being ridiculous and that he'd watched too many detective dramas, essentially laughed him out of the police station, but Nels was convinced it had something to do with this woman. And that ex was called Stephanie Lazarus. And Sherri's father had a reason to be worried about her. She was an absolute lunatic. And even worse, she was a highly regarded LAPD officer. So Stephanie Lazarus was born the 4th of May 1960 in Santa Monica to parents Shelton and Carol. She also attended UCLA when she turned 18, and this is actually where she met John Rutten. She was a freshman, he was a sophomore, but they both lived in the same college accommodation, which is like a co-ed building. They lived on the same floor. In fact, they lived only a few doors away from each other. The people on this floor made friendships quickly, and they actually made a friendship group that would hang out regularly, and in this group were both Stephanie and John. Stephanie, very much like John, was quite athletic, she was fit, she loved to work out, she loved to live a healthy lifestyle, and as I just said, this is very similar to the way John wanted to live. So Stephanie and John would bond over this fitness, and they became fast friends, or at least that's how John saw it, which we'll talk about more later. But they hung out a lot, they spent a lot of time together. They did kiss a few times at this point, but that was kind of as far as it went with John. And every time they did have an intimate kissing moment, from what I can gather and from what I've heard, it was normally when they were out drinking, partying, that kind of thing. So for John, it was more of a friends with benefits situation. Stephanie did actually become quite close to his family. She would go on trips with them, and she spent a lot of time with his mother and with his sister. And it seems that Stephanie was under the impression that they were dating at one point, but as I've already mentioned, this isn't how John felt. Although his family did think at one point that they were a couple, and it was just very confusing for everybody because John kept Stephanie at arm's length, he wanted to be friends with her, but it seems everybody around him thought that they were in a relationship. So I think it's pretty clear that John wasn't very clear with his feelings towards Stephanie, even to Stephanie's face. He wasn't very clear about this, which doesn't help in a situation like this. After John graduated in 1981, he moved into his own apartment. He still spent a lot of time with Stephanie. He considered her his best friend. The pair did actually sleep together at this point. So in the summer of 1981, Stephanie would go around his house a lot, and one thing led to another, and they did end up having a physical relationship over the summer break. Stephanie then graduated a year later with a degree in political science and sociology. The pair still continued to spend a lot of time together. They would take more trips together. They would have what John called irregular sex, so it wasn't a regular occurrence, but it was on and off here and there. They would have intimate relations. The summer of 1982, when Stephanie graduated, she basically straight away went into the LA police department. She spent the next few months attending the police academy. She bought herself a new apartment where John and his brother helped her move in and to decorate. They still seemed very, very, very close, and they were still having sex at this point and spending time together. They would go out for meals and to concerts and those kind of things, and I think Stephanie saw them as dates, whereas John saw them as friends hanging out who ended up having sex. It's very strange. I don't know why John would think that. Naivety, stupidity, being a male. They don't always think the same way as females. But it was very, very confusing to Stephanie. But in John's defence, they never really spoke about the status of their relationship. Stephanie never brought it up, John never brought it up, so it was just very confusing for all. But Stephanie was aware at some point over that the year that she was in the few months that she was in the police academy, she did become aware that John didn't feel the same way that she felt. We don't know how this transpired. We don't know whether John made her feel this way or whether somebody else told Stephanie. John never told Stephanie himself. That is something we're very clear on, but we don't know. But we do know that she was madly in love with John. She was obsessed. She was infatuated with him. She would complain about the whole situation to friends. It was just very clear that she was very, very, very much in love with John Rutten at this point. On the 4th of June 1985, so this was 3 years after Stephanie graduated from college, she had still been spending some time with John, but it wasn't as regular as it used to be. And at this time, she found out from a mutual friend that John and Sherri were engaged. She knew that they had been dating. She didn't think it would go any further than that. She was convinced John would one day come back to her. So when she found out that they were engaged, she was very, very upset. It was extremely difficult for her. On the night of the 4th of June, she calls John and she's crying and she asks him to come over, to which he stupidly does. He goes over to her apartment and, long story short, she tells him that she's in love with him and he tells her that he doesn't feel the same way. She says she understands, but somehow along the way, they end up sleeping together. Now, this is obviously not great. This is bad. John has at this point cheated on his girlfriend, and there is nothing I detest more than cheaters, rapists, serial killers, murderers. But a cheater is just in the same pile. They are inconsiderate, they are selfish, and I don't know, because I wasn't there, what led to John thinking that this was some kind of good idea. From what we can gather, the encounter seemed to be an, inverted commas, goodbye thing. And at this point, for some reason, Stephanie kind of figures out that she's never going to be in a relationship with John, or at least not at the moment, and that the relationship for her has now come to an end. It's all very strange. I don't understand it myself. I don't know if you guys understand it. But essentially, at this point, it was a goodbye and the sex at this point was done. I do need to point out that despite the fact he claims to be very much in love with Sherri, and obviously we know that he's now cheated on Sherri, he didn't tell Sherri what happened at this point. But a few months after this encounter, in August of that year, Stephanie actually decides to pay a visit to the hospital where Sherri works. And why? Well, she shows up at Sherri's office wearing a tiny pair of shorts and a tank top, asks for Sherri. She's told that Sherri is out at lunch, so Stephanie decides to just wait for her. When Sherri returns, she obviously sees Stephanie sitting outside of her office. I would imagine at this point she has either anger, concern, a pit in her stomach, knowing that something isn't right. But she still invites Stephanie into her office because that's the type of person she is. Sherri is a nice person. What we do know comes mainly from Sherri's secretary. She says that Stephanie and Sherri stay in the office for a few minutes. In this time, we now know that Stephanie told Sherri that if she can't have her, nobody can. And she also does tell Sherri that her and John had slept together a few months previously. Stephanie then, with a little attitude and a little hair flick, left, and Sherri emerged from the office crying and told her secretary she was going home and not to disturb her for the rest of the day. That evening she calls her parents and she tells them what Stephanie had said, and then when John comes home later, she does confront him about this. He tells her obviously that how sorry he was, he begged for her forgiveness, and Sherri did, from what we gather, Sherri did forgive him. She probably forgave him, but wouldn't forget what happened. It's all confusing to some people. It's difficult for anybody to say because we're not in that situation right now. So, is Sherri silly for forgiving him? No, I don't think so. She was married to this man. She loved this man. She never really trusted Stephanie anyway. The pair had briefly met. It's just, yeah, I don't understand it, but it is what it is. They decided to try and move forward in their lives. And then on the 6th of August 1985, Stephanie actually sends a letter to John's mother. And in this letter, she talks about how devastated she is that John's picked Sherri over her. She also tells her how much she will miss the entire family and that they have been wonderful to her. And it's just really a really sad, pathetic letter. Why she decides to write to John's mother, I will never know. She probably thought that it was going to help her case in some way. If I can find the letter, I will pop it in here. Please feel free to pause and read if you want to. And then it's December 1985 and going into January of 1986. And this is where things start to get a little bit weird. So Stephanie would randomly show up at Sherri and John's condo. On one occasion, she bought some skis and asked John if he would wax them for her. She stood and spoke to John for ages. In fact, in the end, Sherri had to actually ask her to leave. Sherri even asked him not to wax the skis, but he did it anyway. And then a week later, Stephanie obviously comes back to the condo again. She came to pick up her skis, but this time she didn't stay very long. And this in itself is a very weird thing because John is supposed to be cutting all contact with Stephanie because they had that, inverted commas, goodbye sex. And he knows that he's now been caught sleeping with Stephanie behind Sherri's back. So you would think that he would cut all ties with Stephanie, and if Sherri asked him not to wax the skis, you'd think he wouldn't. But it just seems like Stephanie did have some weird hold over him that he probably didn't even realise himself existed. In mid-January, Stephanie did something that actually really freaks me out, and it actually, when I first heard this, put chills right up my spine. So on this particular day, Sherri had decided to go into work a bit later. John left at his normal time in the morning, but at 10 a.m. before Sherri left, Stephanie showed up at the condo again, but this time she was inside of the condo. Yes, you heard me right. Stephanie was standing in the living room. Sherri didn't let her in. She must have broke in somehow and was just stood in the middle of their fucking living room. I can't imagine what was going through Sherri's head. Obviously, she completely freaks out. She completely loses her cool, and rightly so. She screams at Stephanie. She's absolutely terrified, and she kicks her out. Stephanie made up some excuses that she was there to see John, but it was the middle of the week, and she was actually stood there in her police uniform, so freaky. Sherri obviously told her never ever to come back again, and if she did, she would call the police. Later that day, Sherri did tell her father what had happened, and they did talk about reporting Stephanie, but because she was a police officer, they felt that it would just be laughed at and it wouldn't be taken seriously, so they decided just to keep it under their hats and just remember it, like have it stored. Stephanie had broken into their home and was obviously a mentally unstable woman in their opinion. Sherri also felt like she was being followed all the time. I mean, could you imagine? But she just felt like she was always being watched and that she was always feeling like she had to look over her shoulder, which is also terrifying. The couple also did end up getting some prank calls as well. So the caller would ring the phone and they would answer, but no one would actually speak. This carried on for a few weeks and then it just randomly stopped. Also, in the months leading up to Sherri's murder, Stephanie had a male roommate who stayed in her apartment with her, who she actually used to talk to about John. He would later say in an interview that she didn't speak about anything else ever. She would cry about him constantly. She would talk about how much she hated Sherri. He got so uncomfortable about this situation that he actually ended up moving out of the apartment because Stephanie was clearly a woman on the edge and she was absolutely obsessed with John Rutten. All of these incidents made Nell very confident that the ex-girlfriend was involved. He would continue to tell the lead detective Maya to talk to her, but not once was she questioned about this case. He doesn't even write her name on the suspect list. It never comes up until years later. The police also have something that is called chronological reports. These are used to document all and any activity in a case that they do, so that it can be picked up at a later date by other investigators if needed. However, strangely in this case, the first 3 months of these reports were lost and they've never been found. Also, Stephanie was never mentioned in the report in terms of the shady crap that she was doing. The only time she is actually mentioned is when they confirm that she is John's ex. That's it. But they don't say she's a suspect. They don't talk about her suspicious behaviour. They don't bring up anything. Unfortunately, after several months, the murder into Sherri goes cold. And as I mentioned earlier, the 2 Latino men were never charged with her murder and they were never charged for breaking into her home. Over the next few years, Sherri's parents keep in contact with the LAPD, but there was never anything new to report. And then we actually jump all the way forward to 1993. The lead detective, Maya, finally retires. Thank goodness, or you would think, but no. The new detective is just as shit as he was. Also in 1993, DNA technology took a massive step forward. Some new technology was actually introduced into America, and it was DNA testing that had been used to solve a cold case in Leicester in England where 2 young girls had been raped and murdered, and later the DNA was linked to a man who was then convicted of the murder, and this case was also a cold case, and this was a massive, massive step. This DNA technology was now being used in America. Sherri's parents contact the new detective about this, but he tells them that they don't have the money for the new testing, and they also don't have any suspects to compare DNA against anyway. Sherri's father, Nell, offers to pay for the DNA testing, but once again they say no, still claiming that they don't have any suspects to test the DNA against, so it would be a waste of his money. And this obviously results in the case going cold once again. Over the following years, Stephanie and John do reconnect, but before he does this, he does actually contact the police to make sure that there was no way that Stephanie was involved in the murder of his wife. He's told that she's not even considered a suspect and he should consider moving forward with her. So he actually does. He decides to start seeing her again. They go on trips and they have sex a couple of times. But they still don't get together properly and they're not in a relationship. And actually, and interestingly, they end up losing touch and Stephanie moves on. She marries another LAPD officer who she adopts a daughter with. John also remarries and starts a family with another woman. And it's all very interesting because Stephanie was so fucking obsessed with John that you would think once she got her claws back into him again after she had eliminated the one person that stood in her way. If you haven't guessed it, Stephanie is obviously the person that did this. I mean, I think that's obvious by now, so this shouldn't really be a spoiler, but spoiler alert. And so you would think she would keep hold of John and, like, make sure he never leaves. But they just end up drifting apart, which is really weird. And it also seems like a waste. Like, she wasted Sherri's life for absolutely no reason, which makes this even more infuriating than it already is. Also, in the years following Sherri's death, Stephanie makes it big within her job. She becomes really, really respected and moves up ranks really quickly. She works her way up the ladder, even becoming a highly motivated member of the drug control department within the LAPD. She goes around schools talking to kids, she wins awards, she's just praised for her job, and she is good at her job. And ironically, she ends up working in the Internal Affairs Department, where she would investigate other officers that are suspected of crimes. Which, you know, eye roll. I mean, you can't see me, but eye roll massively. And then after this, she went on to work in the Department of Art Theft and Fraud, which is actually a really high-profile position within the LAPD. And she was just generally a good police officer, being named Officer of the Year twice. She was never faulted within her job. People loved her. She was well known in the community. She just seemed to have everything now that she wanted and desired. And that brings us up to the year of 2001. The LAPD developed the LAPD Cold Case Homicide Unit. This was basically a group of detectives that specialised in cold case murders, and a lot of police departments now have these all over the world. So because of the new DNA technology, the LAPD were given $50,000 as a budget to use on cold cases that they selected. Many cases were submitted to this unit, from police officers to family members to the community. And in 2003, a officer actually submits the case of Sherri Rasmussen to the unit. This officer hasn't been identified, and they don't need to be, but this was put on their desk. So they decided to take a brief look. The DNA that they had was sent to the lab to be tested, but the case wasn't actually picked up until a year later by the DNA analyst. But anyway, it takes a whole year for her to get to this DNA because she's swamped with all the new DNA technology being used. Her lab isn't massive, she doesn't have a lot of staff, so it takes her a while to plod through all this DNA because it's not a fast thing to do. All of the blood on this swab comes back as Sherri's blood, and the DNA analysis then goes to check the saliva on the bite mark that was on Sherri's arm, and this is where it becomes interesting. Although when Frances is looking through the evidence list of things that need to be tested, she can obviously see on the list that there is supposed to be a swab with saliva on from the bite mark on Sherri's arm. However, this evidence wasn't actually in the evidence bag, and at that moment it can't actually be found. It takes the DNA analysts 6 hours to find it, and they actually find it in the back of the freezer, where it had been sat for 18 years. I don't even know what to say, so moving on. The specialist sends it off for more testing, and then in January 2005, so nearly another year later, the results come back and they find out the saliva is actually female. Frances runs this saliva through the DNA database, but they don't find any matches. So she contacts the lead detective, who tells her that it's probably but just a female home invader or an accomplice to the male one. So they're still going on the fact that they think that the house was broken into by some burglars, and maybe it was a male and a female, so that's where the saliva's come from. But Frances wasn't happy with this. She felt that she was being dismissed and that they weren't taking this seriously. So she actually took it upon herself to look through the case files, and she sees the name of a woman. And this woman was a woman that worked at the hospital with Sherri, but we don't know her name. Her name has been kept private, and that's fine. She also sees a note about an LAPD officer, and the name isn't mentioned, but she does ask the detective about this, and he says, quote, "The LAPD officer, no, she's not involved," end quote. He then explains that the victim's husband had an on and off relationship with a woman in the department, but she was never a suspect, she isn't a suspect, and she will never be a suspect. Frances does find this strange, but without the go-ahead of the lead detectives, you can't do anything, and he is very dismissive, and he's basically saying, no, this woman has nothing to do with it. So, again, this case goes cold. And then we're going from 2005 to February of 2009. And this case once again gets picked up by Detective Jim Nuttall. And Jim Nuttall and his team are absolute bosses. They smash this shit. Love it. Chef's kiss. He reads the case file and thinks that something just doesn't add up. He takes the case and his concerns to his supervisor, a man called John Barb, and finally this case is taken seriously. He isn't dismissive. He wants this case solved, no matter who the killer is. And if it does turn out to be one of their own, then this person needs to be punished. This crime was brutal, it was unnecessary, and it had gone cold for far too long, and it needed solving. So John Barb assigned 2 more people to the case, so that's Mark Martinez and Pete Barbera, and these 4 men work this case together and in depth. And based on the saliva sample, they decide that they need to look into any females that are connected to this case, and they end up working it down to about 5 females that are mentioned somewhere in the case files. They then use the DNA from the saliva swab to eliminate these people, and they managed to eliminate 4 of them very easily. So the first one was Sherri's mother, and then it was her sister, Carrie, and then her old roommate Jane that lived in the condo before John moved in, and the woman that worked at the hospital with, who was on the list. She didn't like Sherri, but the woman that was never named earlier by the DNA analysis, Frances, I don't know if you remember, but she was also eliminated. And this only left one woman, and that woman was Stephanie Lazarus. And the reason that she was even on the list of 5 people is because she was brought up to be John's girlfriend. And it had nothing to do with the fact that the police thought of her as a suspect at the time, because the original detectives obviously didn't. But her name was mentioned as a link to John, so she was put on the list. The men decided at this point they would have to work this case in private, as Stephanie was obviously a well-respected member of the police force. They all knew her. She in fact worked across the hall from where they were working, so they just nicknamed her Number 5. They never used her name, and they were very secretive about the case. They didn't talk about it to anyone, including their own families. During the investigation, they found out that the officers in the 80s were actually issued 38-point caliber guns as their spare guns. This is a massive thing, because these guns are obviously monitored very, very closely by the gun registry. So the team would be allocated these guns, and they would continuously be monitored, because we have to, they're firearms. So the detectives who were investigating now decided to put her details into the database, and they actually found out that 13 days after Sherri was killed, Stephanie had reported her gun as missing. And if you've not guessed it, or if you don't remember from earlier, Sherri was killed by a 38-point caliber gun. Unfortunately, they can't match her gun, and because the gun is missing, they don't know where the gun is, but they can match her DNA. So they have an undercover detective follow her around, hoping that she will drop or eat something and just throw it away, so they can test her DNA in secret. And then finally, on the 28th of May 2008, so this was 3 years after they'd started investigating, she goes to Costco with her daughter, Stephanie does, where she has a pizza and a can of pop. She throws the rubbish in the bin, and as soon as she does this and she's gone around the corner, the detective that's been following her gets the can out of the rubbish and sends it off to the lab for testing. And it comes back as an 100, not a 99.9999%, an 100% match to the saliva on the bite mark that was on Sherri's arm. So they've got her. Finally, they have Stephanie for this crime. One of the biggest points about this case, actually, is her interview video, because that thing is crazy. So once they have this information, they know they have to go and find a detective to interview her. They approach 2 new members of the force. So these men didn't know Stephanie very well, and she didn't know them very well. They were Dan Jaramillo and Greg Stearns, and you know, she couldn't accuse these men of being biased, or the public couldn't accuse these men of being biased because they didn't know her well enough. Dan and Greg look through the case files, and they then decide to take the case to the district attorney, which, you know, is what would have been happening anyway, and they ask for a warrant to arrest her. On the 5th of June 2008, the warrant finally comes in. So they know that they need to talk to her, but they don't want to make a big scene, so they want to stage an interview about something else and essentially trick her to come down. So they tell her that they need her assistance with interviewing a suspect about theft, about an art theft. So she would come down to the jail, which was in the basement of the LAPD headquarters. She heads down with them, where she has to hand over a gun, as you aren't allowed to take them into the jail part of the offices. And then she's taken into an interview room. The room is empty, which was probably a shock to her. They sit her down and they actually start questioning her immediately. And this whole video can be seen on YouTube. I will link it below and I'll put some clips in. But for those of you that don't want to watch it, I will break it down a little bit. So in the video, it begins with lots of pleasantries. The police are telling her that they need to talk to her about a cold case, but they didn't want to embarrass her, so that's why they had lied to her, and she's basically like, that's fine, I understand. They then begin to ask her about her relationship with John.
There's some notes to see as far as your name being mentioned.
Okay.
Do you know John Rutten?
John Rutten? John Rutten?
Rutten.
Oh, yeah, I went to school with him.
You did?
Yeah.
How long did you know him?
Gosh, I went to school in, let's see, went to UCLA in 1978 I started, and, you know, met him at school, at the dorms.
Were you guys friends, close friends?
Yeah, we're very close friends. I mean, what's this all about?
And I think you can hear her voice starting to panic a little bit, but she's masking it quite well. She tells them that, yeah, she dated him for a while, but then kind of asked what this was about. The detectives then begin to ask her about his wife.
9 now.
Had you ever met his wife?
I may have.
Do you remember her name or anything, or? Or what she did for a living, or where she worked, or anything about her?
Well, I think I'm going to say that I think she was a nurse. Man, I can't even remember how he said he met her. Yeah, I mean, it's been so long ago.
Well, let me ask you, did you go to their wedding, you know?
No, I didn't go to their wedding.
And Stephanie acts like a complete idiot. She acts dumb. So she pretends like she doesn't even know what her name is. And
maybe if you told me, I would remember it.
Do you remember her first name?
Shelly,
Sherri, I don't know, something maybe, you know. Like I said, it's been so many years, and
from all the years, as far as you can remember, do you remember ever talking to her? Just
well, I said earlier, you know, I mean, I may have.
She's not even saying it correctly, so she says like Shelly, Sherri, which is clearly a lie. She knows her name. She becomes flustered and tells them that she doesn't think she even met Sherri, to which the police ask her about the confrontation at Sherri's workplace, and she denies this fact completely. She says, no, I don't think I've even ever spoken to Sherri. She continuously says as well that this happened such a long time ago that she can't remember, which is bullshit if you ask me. All the way through, she's kind of making faces, surprise or fake disgust. She even laughs when they say they have witnesses that said she has a problem with Sherri. She becomes quite arrogant at some points. She's just lying, and it's just annoying because you can see that she's lying. She does eventually admit that she spoke to Sherri, but denies arguing with her.
Hospital, maybe. You may have talked to her at a hospital.
Yeah, yeah, I may have. You know, I'm thinking back now. You guys are bringing up all these whole memories.
No, it kind of dusts off the cuff.
You know, I mean, geez. I'm thinking that because I mean, we would date. He would date other people. I would date other people, and I think, you know, at one point, I mean, he may have been dating her, or I don't know, maybe he was married, I don't even remember. And I'm like, you know what, why are you calling me if you're either dating her or living with her or married to her? Because I honestly don't remember the time frame. And I'm like, oh, come on, knock it off. And now I'm thinking I may have gone to her and say, hey, you know what, is he dating you? He's bothering me. And so I'm thinking that we had a conversation about that. One or two maybe. It could have been three. I don't want to say I had 3 conversations with her.
No.
Like at her work or at their house or.
No, I'm thinking that he obviously must have told me where she worked. I'm thinking it was a hospital somewhere in LA, and I could have been. Again, what year was that? Where was I working? I'm trying to think of where. When did you say they got married?
I don't know. I think it was like in '85 or '86 or something like that. We just kind of picked this up. We don't know a lot about it. And when you say that you may have, that you talked to his wife, said, hey, I don't know if it was, I guess it wasn't his wife at that time, girlfriend or whatever. And
I don't know if it was his wife or his girlfriend. I mean, quite honestly, I don't even remember.
When you said, like, hey, he's calling me, he needs to knock it off or what have you, I mean, was that civil? Was there,
no, there was not. I don't think there was anything. If the conversation lasted a few minutes, I can't even remember. And what is it like, we went out to lunch or anything.
Right, but there was no, like, arguments or fights
I don't think
it didn't get heated or anything like that?
Not that I recall, no. I mean, I would think that would stand out, I would think. Now, again, that's not standing out in my mind.
So you didn't have any problems with her then?
No.
You didn't have any issues with her?
No, I mean...
The detectives then ask her if she's willing to give DNA. She says maybe.
...were turned on you.
I understand, no.
No, that's what we're telling you. I mean, you're free to go whenever you want. If this makes you uncomfortable and you want to...
now you're starting to make me uncomfortable.
The thing is, I mean, detectives did what they could at that time on the crime scene, okay? And the burglary thing you're talking about, that is an angle that they looked at. I go, but now we're looking at everything else on the case, because nobody was ever arrested on the case.
I don't know that or not.
Okay. Now, what we'd like to do is, obviously you know about all the DNA stuff and things of the nature that, gets done on cases nowadays. If we asked you for a DNA swab, would you be willing to give us one?
Maybe. Because now
because
now I'm thinking I probably need to talk to a lawyer.
Okay.
I mean,
well,
because I know how this stuff works. Okay, don't get me wrong. You're right. I have been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
And I wish I had been recording this because now it sounds like there's you're selling these people saying I'm fighting with her, and now it sounds like you're trying to I've been doing this a long time.
Yeah, we know.
Okay. And now it almost sounds like you're trying to pin something on me. No, now I got that sense.
Well, what it gets to on these cases, and you know it as well as I do, our job is to identify and eliminate suspects.
I can't believe this.
So if we ask you to the point to give us a DNA sample, a buccal swab, so we can identify or eliminate you, would you be willing to do that?
Maybe.
But then she gets flustered again and talks about getting a lawyer, but she makes it clear that she thinks this whole thing is insane and that she's done nothing wrong.
I just can't even believe it. I mean, it's just, I'm shocked. I'm really shocked that somebody would be saying that I did this. I mean, we had a fight, and so I went and killed her. I mean, come on.
Well,
that's...
Okay. All right.
Well, thanks for giving me the courtesy. I wish I could record it.
Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, Stephanie, take care.
All right.
The interview is then obviously forced to end because she wants a lawyer, but what Stephanie doesn't know is that the officers are stood outside ready to arrest her and officially charge her with Sherri's murder. And once she leaves the room, they do this and they bring her back in.
This is absolutely crazy.
Have a seat, Stephanie.
This is insane.
Okay. Okay, Stephanie, you know you have the right to remain silent. Do you understand?
Yes.
Anything you say may be used against you in court. Do you understand?
Yes.
You have the right to the presence of an attorney before and during any questioning. Do you understand?
Yes.
If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be appointed for you free of charge before any questioning if you want. Do you understand?
Yes.
if you want to talk to us right now.
No.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
This
then.
is crazy.
Okay.
This is I'm like in shock. I'm totally in shock.
A few days later, she is officially charged with the murder. She pleads not guilty, and her bond is set at $10 million. And she kind of sits in jail for a bit. I think she's on house release at some point. I forgot to look into this. I'm sorry. But on the 6th of February 2012, her trial finally begins. Stephanie, even to this day, the day we're sitting here right now, and I'm filming this on the 7th of Feb 2022, she still claims that she is innocent. We don't know what happened. From her words, from her side, she says she didn't do this. But based on evidence at the scene, the prosecution have a theory about what happened. So they theorise that on the day of the murder, Stephanie enters the home, maybe through an open door, it's unclear, but with John leaving for work and Sherri in the bedroom, he may have left the door open, who knows. Stephanie may have even picked the lock. She had been boasting to friends about her lock-picking skills, and she had books on the subject in her apartment, and she also wrote in her journal about lock-picking, so she could have just picked the lock. Sherri was in her bedroom, in her bed, and Stephanie entered the room and shot Sherri. The shot went right through her body, exiting out of her back and through the glass doors that were smashed. And that's the glass that John sees when he arrives home and it's all over the garage. Sherri then gets out of her bed and she begins to fight with Stephanie. The lady struggled throughout the house, knocking over furniture, pulling down items, and at some point Sherri made her way towards the alarm, which had a panic button, and this is where she left one of her bloody handprints, and Stephanie likely dragged her away, where Sherri then made a break for the door. So she didn't manage to touch the panic button, and she tried to flee. Again, Stephanie would have dragged her back, eventually hitting Sherri over the head with the vase. It's very likely Sherri was dazed, possibly even unconscious. Stephanie then ties her hands, got a sheet, used it as a muffler, and shot Sherri through the chest 2 more times at close range. The autopsy also revealed that the bite mark was inflicted either during the time that Sherri was dying or after she was dead, which indicates intense rage, because why would you need to bite somebody after they were already laying dead on the floor or dying? And then Stephanie goes on and stages the scene to look like a burglary, moving bits around, and obviously she takes the marriage certificate because in her head this psychologically makes sense. We know it doesn't, but she probably burnt it because she was so angry, like this was going to do anything, but in her mind it would have worked. The trial revealed some pretty damning information, though, that we didn't know before, and it was revealed that Stephanie took 3 days off after the murder. She had no alibi of the time around the murder. Nobody had seen her, nobody had spoken to her, and she kind of went into hiding for 3 days before she returned to work. The trial lasted until the 8th of March. The jury were only out for 24 hours when they came back and found her guilty of first-degree murder and personal use of a government firearm. Stephanie was shocked, and you can see it on her face as the verdict is read out. So she thought she was still gonna get away with this, despite the fact that DNA linked her physically to the crime scene. She's a police officer. Is she thick? On the 11th of March 2012, she was sentenced to 27 years to life by the judge, but she was awarded 1,000 days for time already served and good behaviour. She immediately launches an appeal. I don't really know what based on. I don't know how she can, but that was immediately denied. She's currently serving her sentence now, that's it really. She's in prison, and we don't know when she's getting out. Again, I didn't really look into when her first parole would be, but I mean, you can count on for 27 years, so she's not going to be out for a little while. But I do want to quickly talk about the LAPD and their mishandling of this case, because this is such a common occurrence in the videos that we do, and I promise it's not a coincidence, but for the love of God, what the actual crap? What is happening? Police officers are supposed to be there to protect their communities and bring criminals to justice, but it's so clear, or at least in the LAPD, that they always protect their own. And this makes me wonder, 1, did they know? If they thought she was innocent, then why didn't they just rule her out properly? They never even spoke to her about it. 2, what else are the police hiding? I mean, it's just a thought. they obviously protect their own. So who knows how many rapists and killers and serial killers are currently working in the police force? We won't know. It's just insane to me that this kind of thing keeps happening. It's more so in the older cases. I mean, there is a few at the moment that are going on where the officers are just completely shit. But it's just shocking to me that this still happens and that it happens so much. It's crazy. But anyway, my loves, that's my video for today. It's a little bit of a longer one. Again, I'm sorry that I took so much time off, and I will try and upload as regularly as I can. I really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much for clicking on my video. It means the world to me. Again, please don't forget to subscribe, like, comment, share if you think this is worth sharing. Get your friends and family to subscribe to me. I would appreciate it. I'll also link all my socials down below so you can come and follow me over there. My Instagram is a bit more of a personal page, but it's there. I also have Facebook and Twitter and all those kind of things, so I'll link them all down below. Again, thank you so much for being here. I love you, and stay safe. Okay guys, love you, bye.
Jet planes in the night sky with you, getting high in the sunrise with you, getting through all the bad times with you. I wasn't missing a thing, no I do. And I wish that I could build a time machine, 'cause time moves on, and now you're gone. Oh, if only I could build a time machine, I'd come and get you. I can't forget you.